have you ever realized that the most important moment of a day is not when you wake up full of determination, nor when you try to control everything that is happening, but rather the few very quiet minutes before you fall asleep? We grow up with the belief that reality changes through daytime action, making better decisions, working harder, thinking more positively. But Carl Jung saw human beings through a different logic. He believed that most of our psychological life is not determined when we are trying to control life, but when the ego temporarily steps back and the unconscious begins to speak. Before sleep, the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious becomes the softest. What you carry into the night, your attitude, emotions, the way you talk to yourself, does not disappear when you sleep, but continues to operate beneath the surface, restructuring how you perceive and respond to the world. Speak to your mind. Like this before you sleep is not a self-improvement technique or a set of mechanical positive affirmations. In the Jungian spirit, it is a shift in your relationship with your own psyche. Learning to close a day without self-condemnation, to listen instead of control, and to allow the inner life to complete what the day has not yet understood. When the inner dialogue changes, outer reality gradually shifts along with it, not loudly, but sustainably. In this journey, we will explore what truly happens to the mind before sleep, why the night is a space of psychological renewal, and how the quiet whispers you offer yourself each evening can become the starting point of an entirely different reality. Perhaps you will realize that the transformation you seek does not begin in the morning, but always begins in the silent darkness just before you close your eyes. Number 1. The moment before sleep, the border between conscious and unconscious. There is a very special moment in the day that most of us pass through without ever recognizing its value. It is not the morning when you set goals, nor the middle of the day when you try to control everything. It is a few minutes before you fall asleep. That moment is fragile, quiet, and almost invisible. But in Carl Jung's psychology, it is the soft boundary between consciousness and the unconscious, where the daytime self begins to step back, and the deeper inner life begins to breathe. As Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." During the day, the ego operates like a strict manager. It organizes, evaluates, categorizes, and controls behavior so that you can fit into the world. You reply to emails, complete tasks, and fulfill your roles in family and society. The persona, the social mask, is worn tightly. Everything must be logical, structured, and controlled. But when night falls, when the light softens and the body begins to relax, the ego can no longer maintain the same intensity. It does not disappear, but it weakens. And in that weakening, a natural doorway opens. Imagine the mind as a two-story house. The upper floor is a brightly lit living room where you receive guests, think logically, and make decisions. The lower floor is a vast basement where memories, unlived emotions, images, symbols, dreams, and even parts of yourself you have never named are stored. During the day, the door to the basement is usually closed or only slightly open. But before sleep, that staircase becomes clearer. The light upstairs dims, and you begin to hear faint sounds from below. This is not something to fear. It is the life of the psyche. Jung believed that the unconscious is not a chaotic dark place, but a living and intelligent part of the soul. He saw dreams as the psyche's self-regulating mechanism, a way to balance the distortions of the day. And importantly, the moment before sleep is when the mind is most receptive to symbols. When the ego relaxes, the language of logic gives way to the language of images. The thoughts you whisper to yourself at this time are not merely words. They become material for dreams, for deeper psychological structures. There was a woman I once knew, named Anna. She worked in a high-pressure environment, always needing to appear strong and in control. During the day, she barely allowed herself to feel vulnerable. But at night, when she lay down, she was often pulled into cycles of negative thinking. She blamed herself for not doing enough, worried about the future, and gradually her sleep became heavy. She said she often dreamed of being lost in endless hallways with no exit. When she began to understand Jung, she tried something very small. Instead of criticizing herself before sleep, she started speaking to her mind as if it were a living part within her. Today I tried. There are things I don't understand yet, but I am willing to learn. Just a slight shift in inner dialogue, and her dreams began to change. The hallways were no longer dark. They slowly gained windows, light. She did not immediately change her job, but her inner state changed first. And from that inner shift, her external decisions gradually moved as well. This is not magic. It is a psychological process. What you say to yourself before sleep does not remain at the conscious level. When the ego loosens, words penetrate deeper, entering what Jung called the personal unconscious, and even further into the collective unconscious, where symbols operate more powerfully than reason. If during the day you speak to yourself in a harsh tone, at night dreams will respond with images of conflict. If before sleep you plant an attitude of acceptance and listening, the unconscious will respond with more balanced imagery. You may have experienced this, lying in bed, the lights off, the body tired but the mind still whispering. Small moments from the day suddenly become vivid. A glance, a sentence, a moment you reacted too strongly. During the day, you may dismiss them, but at night, they return. This is not random disturbance. It is the psyche trying to complete experiences that were not fully processed. Jung once wrote that dreams are the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul. That small door does not open when you force it, but when you relax. Therefore, speak to your mind like this. Before you sleep is not a technique of self-suggestion. It is not about repeating positive affirmations mechanically. It is an attitude. It is how you approach yourself in the moment when the ego weakens. Instead of saying, "Why am I like this?" you can say, "I see that, and I want to understand." Instead of suppressing emotion, you acknowledge its presence. That small shift creates a large change, because it reduces inner division. Transformation does not happen because you force yourself to change. It happens when the internal structure changes. And that structure is deeply influenced by boundary moments, where consciousness and the unconscious meet. Before sleep, you are no longer fully in your social role, nor fully immersed in dreams. You are in between. And in that in-between space, your words carry a special weight. If every night you spend a few minutes speaking to your mind with respect, if you treat the unconscious not as an enemy, but as a part that needs to be heard, you are quietly restructuring your reality. Because outer reality is not separate from inner structure. When the unconscious no longer needs to shout to be heard, it begins to cooperate. When the ego stops trying to dominate, it begins to learn how to dialogue. And then you will realize change does not arrive as a dramatic event. It comes as waking up one morning feeling slightly lighter, slightly clearer. Decisions gradually shift, reactions soften, and dreams become guides rather than sources of anxiety. It all begins from a very small moment, when you lie down, close your eyes, and choose to speak to your mind with understanding instead of judgment. In that silence, the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious is no longer a wall, but becomes a bridge. And each night, you cross that bridge, step by step, quietly transforming your own reality. When that boundary moment appears, another process quietly continues, not the immediate falling into sleep, but a shift in the entire rhythm of psychological life. This is often misunderstood as the body not yet falling asleep, while in reality, the mind is passing through a necessary transitional phase after many hours of sustained activity. Number 2. The psychological transition from day to night. Modern people tend to think that sleep should happen like flipping a switch. We lie down and expect all mental activity to stop almost immediately. But analytical psychology shows that the psyche does not operate according to mechanical logic. It shifts states like a living biological system, needing time to gradually reduce intensity after maintaining outward attention all day. Jung once wrote, "The psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains itself in equilibrium as the body does. Just as the body cannot move directly from intense activity to complete rest without a slowing phase, the mind also needs an intermediate period to restore inner balance. Therefore, restlessness before sleep is often not a sign of stress or disorder. It is like an after-echo of a long day of functioning. Many people describe this state as a subtle inner movement, as if the mind has not yet followed the body into rest. But if you observe closely, this is not an increase in activity, but a gradual decrease, like sounds in a room becoming clearer when all devices have just been turned off. Imagine an airport at the end of the day. During the day, planes constantly take off and land. Signals are dense. Runways are fully lit. When night comes, activity does not stop immediately. The final flights complete their journeys. The system gradually reduces traffic. Lights dim in stages before the space becomes truly quiet. No one sees this phase as a malfunction. It is simply a necessary transition. The human mind before sleep operates in a similar way. A patient named Daniel once came to therapy believing he had chronic insomnia. He said that every night, although his body was tired, his mind could not switch off as he wished. He felt frustrated having to wait for sleep and saw that time as a personal failure. For months, he tried various methods to fall asleep faster, but the more he tried to control it, the longer his wakefulness persisted. Through therapy, it became clear that the issue was not his inability to sleep, but that he had not allowed his mind to complete the transition process after a day of high-intensity activity. He carried the daytime rhythm directly into the night, expecting the psychological system to stop instantly. When he understood that the restlessness was simply the psyche naturally slowing down, he stopped treating it as a problem to fix. Soon after, sleep began to return more consistently, not because he learned how to force it, but because he stopped interfering with a self-regulating process that already existed within him. In Jung's observation, Psychological life always moves in rhythms of expansion and contraction, like breathing. Daytime is expansion, attention spreading across work, interaction, and responsibility. Evening is contraction, where outward energy begins to return inward. This is not withdrawal from life, but a condition that allows the psyche to maintain long-term stability. When this inward movement is not completed, a person may sleep enough hours, yet still wake up feeling unrestored. That slowing moment is the quiet foundation for the transformation this journey points toward. Speak to your mind. Like this, before you sleep does not begin with changing thoughts, but with allowing the mind to shift from functioning to rebalancing. Deep change rarely happens when the mind is running at full speed. It appears when the whole system has the chance to adjust its rhythm. In modern life, we often unknowingly extend daytime intensity into the bed. Screen light, continuous information, and sensory stimulation keep the mind operating at the same level. This is like trying to park a fast-moving car without slowing down first. The issue is not movement itself, but that the movement does not end in its proper rhythm. When the transition happens naturally, subjective experience begins to change in a subtle way. Not through excitement or perfect calm, but through a gradual reduction in the pressure to react. Attention is no longer constantly pulled outward, and a more stable presence begins to emerge. This is not a special state to achieve, but the natural psychological rhythm when energy is no longer excessively dispersed. Jung did not see this phase as empty space between 2 days, but as an essential part of self-regulation. When the psyche completes its slowing process, the foundation for the next day's experience is quietly prepared. The way you perceive, choose, and respond is not formed only when you are awake, but is nurtured in this often overlooked transition. Therefore, if before sleep you feel not yet calm, what is happening may not be resistance. It may simply be the natural closing process of a day still unfolding. When you stop forcing its end, the slowing becomes supportive rather than obstructive. And within this gradual descent, the mind prepares to enter deeper states of the night, where more subtle processes continue without any conscious effort from you. Night, therefore, does not begin when you fall asleep, but when the mind learns to slow down after having fully lived a day. And it is this almost invisible transition that creates the stable foundation from which deeper transformations can occur, little by little, each time you allow the psyche to complete its own descent. Number 3. Acknowledging unlived emotions. And when the mind has gradually completed that natural slowing process, a deeper layer of experience begins to emerge, not the shift in rhythm, but the appearance of what did not have enough space during the day to be fully felt. In that quiet state before sleep, many people suddenly realize that what disturbs them is not overthinking, but emotions left unfinished throughout the day quietly returning. People often believe that emotions disappear when we do not pay attention to them. Experiences that are not fully lived do not dissolve. They simply withdraw from consciousness and continue to exist at a deeper level. During the day, the fast pace allows us to move past discomfort through the next action, the next conversation, or the next task. But when night comes, and attention is no longer pulled outward, the unfinished emotional life begins to find its way back. Many have experienced this familiar moment, lying quietly and suddenly recalling a small situation that seemed already past. A look that felt uncomfortable, a sentence left unspoken, or a disappointment quickly dismissed during the day. These emotions do not appear to disturb you. They appear because the psyche is trying to complete what consciousness has not yet acknowledged. Jung wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." What is denied does not disappear. It continues in another form until it is recognized. In Greek mythology, there is the story of Orpheus, the musician who descended into the underworld to bring back Eurydice, his lost wife. He was allowed to lead her back on one condition: he must not turn to look at her until they both reached the light. But as they neared the exit, unable to resist his fear of loss, Orpheus turned back, and Eurydice vanished forever. This story is often seen as a tragedy of love, but from a Jungian perspective, it reflects a deeper psychological movement. What is pushed into the underworld of the psyche cannot be retrieved through control or denial. It can only return when one is able to face its presence without fear or turning away. Night, in this sense, is like a brief descent each person undergoes, a step into the depths where unlived emotions wait to be recognized. From a modern scientific perspective, this also has a clear physiological basis. As the body prepares for sleep, activity in the sympathetic nervous system, responsible for action and response, gradually decreases while the parasympathetic system becomes dominant. This shift reduces the need for immediate reaction and allows the brain to process unfinished emotional experiences from the day. Research on emotional memory shows that before sleep, the brain tends to reactivate emotionally meaningful experiences to integrate them into long-term memory structures. What we feel as an emotional resurfacing is actually part of the process of organizing lived experience. But what matters most is how we respond to that emergence. The habitual reaction is avoidance, turning on the phone, finding background noise, or trying to occupy the mind again. We often think peace comes from not feeling anything. However, Jung observed that psychological wholeness does not come from eliminating difficult emotions, but from allowing them to exist in consciousness without the need to immediately fix or explain them. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Psychological maturity does not arise from focusing only on the positive, but from allowing what has not been seen to enter awareness. The moment before sleep thus becomes a uniquely safe space. There is no demand to act, no role to maintain, no decision that must be made immediately. In that pause, you can recognize that you feel sadness without explaining why, feel jealousy without condemning yourself, feel fear without proving your strength. This acknowledgement is not indulgence, it is the restoration of continuity within the psyche. When emotions are recognized, the energy once used to suppress them begins to release. Interestingly, the change is often subtle. You do not suddenly become happier or solve everything, but the body softens, the breath deepens, and a nameless tension decreases. Not because circumstances change, but because inner conflict reduces. The psyche no longer needs to divide energy between experiencing and hiding the experience. Many believe that to transform reality, they need big decisions or dramatic turning points. But Jung suggested that deep transformation often begins with very small acts of awareness. Simply acknowledging, "Today I felt hurt," or "I am truly anxious," before sleep can create more change than hours of trying to think positively. Because when emotions are lived instead of suppressed, the inner structure becomes less fragmented, and from there, the way you experience the world gradually changes. Speak to your mind. Like this before you sleep does not mean telling yourself perfect things. Sometimes, what needs to be said most is simple honesty, that you are tired, disappointed, or still do not fully understand what you are going through. In that honesty, the psyche no longer needs to create tension to get your attention. It is heard from the beginning. And as the night deepens, emotions that have been acknowledged no longer need to enter sleep as anxiety or vague tension. They become integrated parts of lived experience. Quiet arises not because discomfort has been eliminated, but because there is nothing inside struggling to exist. From this small but real reconciliation, the foundation for transformation begins to form, quietly, patiently, almost imperceptibly in the moment. Yet, accumulating through each night, you allow yourself to fully feel what was once left behind. From those simple moments of acknowledgement before sleep, the reality you experience each day begins to shift in a profound yet sustainable way. And perhaps this is the part each person experiences differently, because no one brings the same emotional story into the night. If you have ever noticed that quiet moments before sleep bring back old emotions, things you never said, never allowed yourself to fully feel, try sharing that. Telling your story is not about seeking advice or judgment, but sometimes simply realizing that we are not alone in learning how to feel ourselves again. I would truly like to read your experience, because those honest sharings can help others understand that what they feel is entirely human. Number 4. Meeting the shadow in silence. But what happens when, after emotions have been acknowledged, you realize that there is still something deeper that does not yet want to reveal itself? No longer just clear sadness or worry, but a feeling difficult to name, as if a part of you is standing at the edge of consciousness, observing in silence and waiting to be seen. Carl Jung called that part the shadow, not as a negative concept, but as all aspects of the self that a person has learned not to identify with. The shadow does not only contain anger, selfishness, or fear, it also holds unrealized potentials, suppressed desires, and strengths that were rejected simply because they did not fit the image we believed we had to become. During the day, constant attention makes these parts difficult to appear. But when night falls and layers of distraction gradually withdraw, the psyche no longer needs to maintain the same familiar structure. It is in that quiet space that the shadow begins to move closer to consciousness. The shadow rarely appears as a clear thought. It often comes in the form of an unexpected reaction, an uncomfortable memory, or a sense of unease when recalling one's own actions. You may have lain still in the dark and suddenly remembered a moment when you behaved more coldly than you wished, or felt discomfort realizing you were jealous of someone else's success. Such experiences often make us want to turn away immediately because they do not match the positive image maintained by the ego. But Jung suggested that this reflex of avoidance creates the deepest inner division. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Imagine the shadow as a room behind a closed door in your psychological house. During the day, light is concentrated in familiar spaces where you feel in control, but that room still exists, whether you enter it or not. When night comes and the entire house becomes quiet, you begin to sense its presence, not through loud noise, but through the feeling that something remains unexplored. Meeting the shadow is not about breaking the door open, but about being calm enough to open it slowly, allowing your eyes to adjust to the darkness before seeing what is there. A man named Michael once came to therapy because he often felt out of control in very small situations. He described himself as calm, rational, and conflict avoidant, yet sometimes exploded with anger over seemingly trivial matters. In the process, what gradually emerged was not an issue of emotional control, but a long-standing denial of his own natural aggression. He had built his entire identity around being a good person, to the point that all strong emotions were pushed out of consciousness. At night, when no social role needed to be maintained, those excluded energies began to surface as tension and unease. Only when he learned to recognize that anger was also a part of him, not something to act on, but something to acknowledge, did his extreme reactions begin to decrease. What changed was not his personality, but his inner wholeness. The important thing is that meeting the shadow is not a confrontation. Jung did not encourage people to dig into themselves forcefully or judge what appears. The shadow does not need to be fixed. It needs to be seen. When you lie in silence before sleep and recognize a part of yourself that you usually avoid during the day, what is needed is not explanation or justification, but simple awareness. This too belongs to me. That moment begins to release the energy that was once consumed to maintain denial. Many people fear that if they face the shadow, they will become more negative. But the paradox Jung pointed out is the opposite. What becomes conscious loses its invisible control. When the shadow is denied, it expresses itself indirectly through defensiveness, judgment of others, or an unexplainable sense of dissatisfaction. When integrated, the energy once suppressed becomes a source of creativity, decisiveness, and vitality. Not because a person becomes more perfect, but because they no longer divide themselves into parts allowed to exist and parts that must be hidden. Night, therefore, becomes a unique time for this meeting. There is no audience, no role, no requirement to maintain any image. In that silence, the shadow can appear without threatening your social structure. And when you learn to remain long enough with that presence, what once felt unsettling begins to lose its oppositional nature. You no longer feel that you are fighting yourself, but expanding the range of what you can accept as human. Speak to your mind. Like this before you sleep, in its deepest meaning, is not only about speaking gently to yourself, but about being willing to listen even to the uncomfortable parts when they arise. Not to change them immediately, but to let the psyche know that no part of you needs to remain in darkness forever. And in that quiet acceptance, the psychological energy once locked away begins to flow again, bringing a greater sense of aliveness and authenticity into the next day. When you fall asleep after such a meeting, what changes is not the external world, but your relationship with yourself. And sometimes, that subtle shift is the true beginning of transforming reality, not by becoming someone else, but by gradually becoming more whole with who you already are. Therefore, what matters is not removing the parts that make you uncomfortable before sleep, but changing how you see them. The shadow does not ask you to act on every emotion, only to acknowledge that they are also yours. When you can recognize a darker part within without fear or denial, psychological maturity begins quietly. You no longer need to overprotect your self-image, but gradually stand more firmly in self-understanding. Each time you remain with the shadow a little longer, inner division decreases, and the energy once suppressed begins to return, serving balance instead of conflict. Number 5. Letting go of the persona before sleep. Perhaps after moving through the deeper layers of emotion and the shadow, a natural question begins to arise. If night is the time when the psyche returns to a more original state, then what truly needs to be set down before we sleep? Not thoughts, not emotions, but roles. Carl Jung used the concept of the persona to describe the psychological mask each person develops in order to adapt to the social world. The persona is not false. It is necessary for humans to work, communicate, and exist within a community. But the problem arises when that mask is no longer taken off, when a person continues to wear it, even in moments when no one is watching. During the day, you may be a leader who must always be certain, a father or mother who must be strong, a colleague who must be professional, a friend who must be cheerful and stable. These roles function effectively because they make the world more predictable. But the psyche is not designed to maintain a single image continuously. When the persona is held for too long, psychological energy begins to drain in a very subtle way. You still complete tasks, still speak normally, but by the end of the day feel exhausted without clearly understanding why. That fatigue often does not come from what you do, but from having no space left to simply be yourself. Think of the image of Robin Williams, one of the most beloved comedians in the world. On stage and in public, he was the embodiment of joy, quick wit, and inexhaustible energy. His persona brought laughter to millions. But those close to him shared that when the lights went out, he often fell into deep silence. That contrast is not a personal paradox, but reflects a universal psychological law. The stronger the persona, the greater the need to remove it. When a person has no space to step out of their role, the psyche begins to seek balance through fatigue, anxiety, or an unexplainable sense of emptiness. The moment before sleep, therefore, carries special meaning. It is the only time of the day when you no longer need to convince anyone about who you are. No need to prove competence. No need to maintain perfect kindness. No need to uphold a stable image. Yet many people unconsciously bring all those roles into bed. They continue thinking like a manager, evaluating themselves as someone who must meet standards, or reviewing the day as a report that needs correction. The body lies down, but the persona keeps working. What Jung realized is that the psyche truly restores itself only when a person temporarily steps out of identification with the persona. Before sleep, the most important act is not controlling thoughts, but gently asking, who was I trying to be today? And can I set that role aside for a few hours? This is not abandoning responsibility, but returning to a balanced state where the ego no longer needs to maintain an image continuously. Imagine wearing formal clothing all day. It is appropriate for work, meetings, and social situations. But if you continue wearing it while sleeping, what once helped you adapt becomes a source of discomfort. The persona is the same. It serves outer life, but sleep belongs to inner life. When these two spaces are mixed, the psyche has no chance to regenerate energy. Many people recognize this clearly in rare nights when they feel truly at ease, nights when there is no need to prove anything, no need to think they should be better, stronger, or more successful. That is the moment you simply allow yourself to exist without performing. And that feeling is often accompanied by deeper relaxation in the body, slower breathing, and a softening of the mind without effort. Perhaps that is why the familiar line in the song "Let It Be" by the Beatles continues to resonate across generations. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, "Let it be." Let it be is not advice to give up, but a reminder to pause the ego's constant control. Before sleep, the psyche does not need you to improve yourself. It only needs you to stop trying to become a version of yourself for a few hours. Speak to your mind like this. Before you sleep, at this level of meaning, becomes a very simple whisper. Today I have done enough. The roles can rest. The image can rest. Even self-evaluation can rest. When you say that to your mind, you are sending a signal that the inner space is safe for the persona to step back. Interestingly, when the persona is released regularly each night, it becomes more flexible the next day. You are no longer trapped in maintaining a fixed image. Naturalness returns to communication, reactions become less defensive, and energy is no longer consumed maintaining a stable exterior. A person paradoxically becomes more authentic in society when they allow themselves to not be socialized during sleep. Jung emphasized that psychological development does not lie in eliminating the persona, but in not completely identifying with it. You can play roles, but not forget they are only parts of you. And before sleep, removing that mask, even in silence, is the act of restoring a healthy relationship between the true self and the social image. Night, in its deepest sense, becomes a space where a person is allowed to return to a state of not needing to perform. No one is watching, no one is judging, no one is expecting. When you lie down and allow all roles to dissolve, the psyche shifts from adaptation mode to restoration mode. And in that state of not needing to be anyone, you begin to touch a simple but rare feeling: to exist without effort. Over time, these moments of letting go of the persona before sleep create a very subtle shift in how you experience reality. You wake up not with the pressure to continue a role, but with a sense of a more stable inner center than any external identity. Reality does not change immediately, but the way you enter it becomes lighter, more flexible, and less bound by the need to maintain an image. And perhaps that is one of the deepest forms of transformation Jung pointed to. Not becoming a new person, but learning each night to return to the person behind every mask. When the persona is allowed to rest, the psyche remembers its original wholeness. And from that quiet wholeness, the reality you experience the next day begins to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a sustainable way that only true inner transformation can bring. Number 6. The body as a gateway to the unconscious. Carl Jung never separated the psyche from the body. He saw them as two expressions of the same living reality. He once wrote, "The body is the manifestation of the psyche." This statement is not merely symbolic, but a practical direction. If you want to access the unconscious, begin from what is most tangible, the body lying in bed each night. Many people try to calm the mind through willpower, but forget that daytime consciousness does not exist only in thoughts, but is anchored in muscle tension, breathing rhythm, and the nervous system's state of alertness. When social roles end, the body often still carries the imprint of a full day of adaptation. Shoulders slightly raised, jaw unconsciously clenched, abdomen tight, breath shallow and short. These are not random habits. They are the physiological aspect of the persona, the body's way of maintaining readiness to respond. If this tension is not recognized, the mind will struggle to descend into deeper layers, even if your eyes have long been closed. Imagine a lake whose surface is constantly rippling. You may try to look through the water to see the bottom, but when the surface is unsettled, vision remains distorted. The body is that surface. When muscles are tense, the heart rate elevated, and breathing rapid, the whole system remains in a state of vigilance. Relaxation is not passive. It is the physical condition for psychological transition. When the surface settles, the depth reveals itself without effort. A very practical example illustrates this. Sarah, a lawyer working in a high-pressure environment, often complained that even after she had thought through everything before sleep, her mind still felt heavy and her sleep fragmented. In therapy, attention shifted not to her thoughts, but to her bodily posture at the end of the day. Her shoulders were always slightly raised, her back rigid, and even lying down, her hands subtly clenched. She had grown accustomed to living in a state of readiness to argue and defend her position, to the point that her body had never truly relaxed. When she began to spend a few minutes before sleep, simply noticing and consciously releasing each muscle group, what changed was not her thoughts, but the depth of her breath. Only when the body slowed did the mind begin to leave the surface level of consciousness. Sleep came not because she solved her problems, but because her nervous system was allowed to shift states. What is notable is that many people first truly feel themselves not when they think more clearly, but when they realize how long their body has been silently enduring. Some only notice their tension after relaxing their shoulders for the first time. Others realize they rarely take a full breath until they do so consciously. These realizations are often small, almost undramatic, yet transformative. Because when the body is allowed to speak, the psyche no longer needs to express itself through anxiety or insomnia to be heard. That simple return to sensation opens a form of understanding not derived from analysis, but from direct experience of being present within oneself. From a scientific perspective, this connection is entirely consistent. The autonomic nervous system regulates both psychological and physiological states. When the body maintains high tension, the brain continues to receive signals that the environment is not yet safe for full relaxation. Conversely, when breathing deepens and slows, the vagus nerve is activated, sending signals back that vigilance can decrease. This opens pathways for brain regions associated with deeper emotional and memory processing. In other words, relaxing the body does not merely create comfort. It changes the biological conditions that allow the unconscious to function more freely. Jung often emphasized that the unconscious does not speak only through symbolic language in dreams, but also through bodily symptoms. Chronic tension, headaches, back pain, insomnia, all may be ways the psyche expresses what has not yet been made conscious. When you lie down and gently bring awareness to the body, you are listening to another layer of the soul's language. Not to analyze immediately, but to notice where the story of the day is still being held. Speak to your mind like this before you sleep. Therefore is not only verbal, it is also a message sent through breath and posture. When you relax the jaw, shoulders and abdomen, You are telling the psyche that there is no longer a need to defend. When you allow your back to sink into the mattress instead of holding it rigid, you are allowing yourself to leave the structure of the day. This message does not pass through thought, but directly into the nervous system, where consciousness and the unconscious meet most deeply. Interestingly, when the body is allowed to rest properly, subtle internal movements become clearer. You may feel the heartbeat, the warmth of your hands and feet, or faint vibrations that were hidden during the day by constant stimulation. This awareness is not the goal. It is a sign that consciousness is descending into deeper layers without losing presence. In that state, sleep is not the collapse of consciousness, but a natural transition. Over time, treating the body as a gateway to the unconscious changes how you understand transformation. You no longer try to think more positively to change reality, but learn to create physiological conditions for inner restructuring. Each night, as you relax layer by layer and let breath guide rhythm, you build a different relationship with yourself, one based on listening rather than control. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: the unconscious is not conquered through effort, but invited through softness. When the body stops holding, the mind stops defending. When the mind stops defending, deeper layers can open without fear. From there, change is no longer something to achieve, but a natural outcome of a system allowed to return to its inherent balance. In that balance, each night becomes a quiet journey where body and psyche slow together, and tomorrow's reality begins to take shape from the simple relaxation of tonight. If this part has touched you in some way, perhaps it is not because you learned something new, but because you realized that your body has been saying this for a long time. You just truly paused to listen today. Thank you for staying and listening until here. If this video helped you see differently the very quiet moments before sleep, take a second to press like so you know that you are not just watching, but truly accompanying your own journey of understanding yourself more deeply each day. Number 7. A Jungian ritual for closing the day. And when the body has gradually slowed and the mind is no longer held in the alert state of the day, a more subtle capacity begins to appear, the ability to look back at the day without the need to defend or condemn oneself. Most of us end a day in one of two familiar ways, either trying to forget everything quickly or replaying our mistakes in the mind with a judgmental tone. We evaluate whether we did well or failed, were right or wrong, enough or not enough. But from Carl Jung's perspective, this way of seeing keeps the psyche trapped in the same loop of consciousness. When the ego seeks only judgment, experience is not digested, it is merely categorized. And what is not understood will return as repeating emotional patterns the next day. Jung did not see end-of-day reflection as a moral act, but as a symbolic process of awareness. He recognized that every reaction during the day, a small irritation, an unexpected attraction, a moment of hurt, is a signal from the inner life attempting to communicate with consciousness. If during the day we live outwardly, the evening is when the psyche gently asks, "What in today's experience truly belongs to you?" Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This means that reactions that seem random are often not random at all. A sentence that disturbs you excessively, a glance that lingers in your mind, or a small situation that continues to echo, all carry psychological meaning far beyond the external event. The ritual of closing the day, in the Jungian spirit, is not about correcting behavior, but recognizing where the psyche has been touched. In the Bible, there is the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel through a long night by the river Jabbok. That struggle did not take place before a crowd, had no spectators, and was not about winning in a conventional sense. Jacob entered the night with fear and deep unrest, and only at sunrise did he leave with a new identity, Israel, yet also carrying a wound in his hip, the mark of an encounter that changed him forever. Symbolically, this story reflects what happens when a person is willing to stay with inner experience instead of escaping it. Transformation does not come from avoiding inner conflict, but from remaining with it long enough in silence. The ritual of closing the day works in a similar logic. You do not need to analyze deeply or find answers immediately. Simply ask gently, "What today made me react strongly?" Not to prove right or wrong, but to recognize what touched something deeper within you. You may notice irritation over a simple comment. You may feel drawn to someone without knowing why. These moments are like footprints of the unconscious, appearing on the surface of consciousness. What matters is the attitude of observation. Jung emphasized that psychological understanding begins not with judgment, but with the ability to witness experience as it is. When you look back at your day without saying, "I should have been better," something very different happens. The psyche no longer needs to defend itself. The energy once used for justification or self-blame begins to transform into awareness. Imagine watching a film in which you played the main role. If you criticize every scene, you miss the whole story. But if you observe with curiosity, you begin to see repeating patterns, familiar situations, emotions arising at the same points, reactions that do not fully belong to the present moment. It is here that individuation, the process of becoming oneself, quietly begins. A woman once shared in therapy that every evening she recalled conversations that left her uncomfortable. Previously, she tried to push them away or blamed herself for being too sensitive. But when she shifted her approach and simply noted, "This touched me," she began to see a deeper pattern. The fear of being dismissed had long been part of her. The day did not create the emotion. It revealed what already existed. That realization did not immediately change her life, but it changed the inner position from which she experienced the world. This is the deeper meaning of "speak to your mind like this before you sleep." You do not speak to the mind to control it, but to establish a cooperative relationship with the unconscious. When you ask instead of judge, the psyche begins to respond with greater clarity. Dreams become more vivid, daytime reactions less automatic, and the feeling of being carried by circumstances gradually decreases. Strangely, this ritual does not make you more perfect. It makes you more conscious. And according to Jung, consciousness is the only factor capable of transforming psychological fate. When experience is seen, it no longer needs to repeat with the same intensity. When reaction is understood, it loses its invisible compulsion. Over time, a few minutes of reflection at the end of the day becomes a silent dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. You begin to see that the next day is not separate from the previous one. It is prepared in the moment you lie down and choose understanding over judgment. External reality gradually shifts, not because circumstances immediately change, but because you are no longer reacting from the same old blind spots. And perhaps this is what Jung pointed to. Human beings do not transform through dramatic decisions, but through small, honest moments of awareness repeated over time. Each night, you review the day with curiosity instead of judgment. The psyche learns that experience can be made conscious rather than pushed into darkness. From there, life no longer simply happens to you. You begin to participate in it more consciously. When you close your eyes after such a ritual, the day truly ends. Not because all problems are solved, but because they have been seen. And in that quiet completion, the mind enters sleep without carrying the burden of what has not been understood. Night becomes a space of integration, and the next morning is not merely a continuation of old patterns, but a lighter step of a psyche gradually becoming whole. Number 8. Practical story. When you stop judging, reality changes. One thing many people do not realize is that we rarely meet others as who we are in the present. Most of the time, we meet them through the psychological residue of the previous day. A day that is not closed continues to live in the reactions of the next, and in that way, reality repeats itself while we believe it is caused by circumstance. Daniel, a man living in Boston, came to therapy not because of a major crisis, but because of a growing sense of distance from those he loved most. He had no serious conflict with family or friends, yet small conversations often ended in vague discomfort. He easily interpreted his wife's silence as disappointment, a friend's light feedback as criticism, or others' busyness as rejection. What exhausted him most was not the conversations themselves, but the hours afterward when he lay in bed replaying every detail. I should have said this differently. I should have stayed quiet. I shouldn't have reacted that way. Each night became a silent courtroom. No one accused him except himself. And although the next day began anew, the sense of defensiveness remained. Jung observed that the psyche is influenced not only by what happens, but by how experience is digested or left unfinished. When a day ends in self-judgment, the mind does not truly rest. It carries that unfinished state into the immediate future. What is not understood does not disappear. It becomes the lens through which we see others. In therapy, Daniel was not asked to change behavior or improve communication. Instead, he was invited to try a very simple ritual before sleep, similar to what was described earlier. To review the day without seeking right or wrong. Each evening, he asked himself only two things. What moment today triggered the strongest reaction? And when did I truly feel connected to someone? No analysis, no correction, no conclusion. Just noticing and leaving it there. At first, he felt it was meaningless. It solved nothing, improved nothing immediately. But after a few weeks, a small shift began to appear. He realized he no longer carried conversations into the next day with the same tension. Words that once occupied his mind for hours gradually lost their weight. When his wife was silent, he no longer rushed to interpret. When friends did not respond immediately, he no longer felt rejected. Not because others changed, but because yesterday had been completed before he entered the new day. Jung wrote that consciousness develops not through controlling life, but through establishing the right relationship with one's own experience. As he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When you observe a day as you would observe a dream, without judgment, without justification, the psyche begins to complete its self-regulating cycle. This creates a quiet effect. You no longer need to defend yourself against what is not actually threatening. Imagine each day as a conversation left unfinished. If you walk away in anger or self-blame, the conversation continues echoing in your mind, affecting every interaction that follows. But when you spend a few minutes before sleep simply reviewing without judgment, it is like gently closing the door, allowing the sound to fade. Not because everything is perfect, but because the experience has been acknowledged. One evening, Daniel shared that he noticed the clearest change in a very ordinary situation. During a family dinner, a casual remark made him feel misunderstood. Previously, he would react immediately or remain silent, but carry discomfort through the night. This time, he simply felt the reaction arise and pass, not because he controlled it, but because there was no longer an accumulation of unfinished days within him. He listened more, responded slower, and the conversation continued naturally. Later, his wife said a simple sentence, "You seem lighter lately." That moment helped him understand that reality does not change when we try to control the future, but when we change how we carry the immediate past into the present. Speak to your mind like this. Before you sleep is not a technique for generating positive thoughts, but a way to help the psyche complete what has been lived. When the day ends without becoming a case against yourself, the mind does not need to defend itself tomorrow. What Jung saw throughout his work is that people often live within the invisible accumulation of undigested experiences. Each new reaction is shaped by dozens of old ones left unresolved. But when you learn to close the day through observation rather than evaluation, this cycle begins to shift. You enter relationships not from a position of proving or defending, but from genuine presence. Transformation, therefore, is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive as a big decision or a clear turning point. It appears when you notice you no longer react as strongly, no longer need to win every conversation, no longer carry the constant urge to fix yourself. And it is this lightness that changes how others experience you. Social reality begins to soften, not because the world has changed, but because you no longer meet it through the residual tension of the previous day. Each night, when you speak to your mind with observation instead of judgment, you teach the psyche that lived experience can be completed without self-punishment. Over time, this creates a deep inner stability. You wake up not as someone continuing an unfinished battle, but as someone beginning a new day with a more open psychological space. And perhaps that is how reality is truly transformed, not by immediately changing circumstances, but by returning to the mind each night the sense that today has been enough. When nothing remains to be judged, the psyche can rest, reorganize, and prepare for a different way of living tomorrow. In that quiet, you begin to realize that the greatest change does not occur when you try to become someone new, but when you stop carrying unresolved versions of yourself into the future. Number 9. Symbolic language before sleep. And when you have learned to close a day without carrying the need for right, wrong, winning, losing, or self-judgment, a more subtle capacity begins to appear at night. You no longer try to understand yourself through thought, but begin to feel inner life through images. Carl Jung recognized that the psyche is not built from concepts, but from symbolic experience. Daytime consciousness operates through logic, reason, and language, but the deeper layers of the soul do not think that way. They respond to form, movement, space, color, and sensation. Jung wrote, "The psyche consists essentially of images." For him, images are not random imagination, but the fundamental structure of psychological life. During the day, people are accustomed to solving everything through analysis. When discomfort arises, we search for causes. When anxiety appears, we try to find solutions. But before sleep, analytical ability weakens. This is not loss of control, but a natural transition into a more ancient mode of perception, where the psyche does not require explanation, but seeks expression. You may notice this in familiar moments, when lying down and closing your eyes, instead of forming complete sentences, the mind begins to create fragmented images. A road appears and disappears, an old room, light through a window, a sense of movement while the body remains still. These images are often dismissed as random, but Jung saw them as the psyche's way of expressing itself when consciousness loosens its control. Imagine the mind as an ocean. During the day, you are on the surface, where waves move quickly and everything demands immediate response. But at night, you descend deeper. In those depths, movement is slower, wider, and symbolic. You cannot command the ocean. You can only learn to feel its current. This is why Jung developed what he called active imagination, not daydreaming, not controlling images, but allowing them to emerge and establishing a relationship with them. Before sleep, the mind naturally approaches this state more than at any other time of day. A simple example illustrates this. Laura, who often felt emptiness at night despite a stable outer life, tried to explain it logically, but failed. In therapy, she was encouraged not to analyze the feeling before sleep, but simply to hold a gentle image. A small lamp glowing in a dark room. No specific meaning was assigned to it. After a few weeks, the change was not dramatic, but her inner state became more stable. She described that when she imagined the light each night, the emptiness no longer felt threatening. What mattered was not the lamp itself, but that the psyche finally had a symbol to contain what language could not express. Jung believed symbols act as a living bridge between the known and the unconscious. When you use a symbol, you are not solving a problem. You are creating a space for the psyche to continue its movement. This is crucial. Symbols do not close meaning, they keep it open. Imagine carrying a full day of interactions, emotions, and unfinished reactions. If you try to think through everything, the mind continues operating as in the daytime. But if you imagine placing those experiences into a slowly flowing river, the psyche understands immediately, without explanation. The image becomes psychological action. This is not mystical. Neuroscience shows that as the brain transitions into sleep, activity shifts from language processing regions to networks associated with imagery and sensation. The brain begins organizing experience through patterns rather than words. What Jung observed clinically is now supported scientifically. Humans integrate life through images before concepts. Speak to your mind, like this before you sleep. Therefore does not always mean speaking in words. Sometimes, speaking to the mind means creating an image that resonates with your inner state. If the day felt heavy, Imagine stepping into an open space. If scattered, imagine fragments gathering together, not to force positivity, but to offer the psyche a form it can hold. The most important element is attitude. Jung emphasized that symbols only live when they are not forced. If you use images as a technique of control, they lose vitality. But when approached with gentle curiosity, like watching a scene unfold, the psyche begins to respond. Over time, this small ritual changes how you enter the night. You no longer leave the day through mental exhaustion, but through a soft transition from thinking to feeling. The mind learns that not everything needs to be solved immediately. Some things only need to be placed into the right image to continue their own process. And here, a deeper transformation begins. You stop trying to control inner life through willpower. Instead, you learn to cooperate with it. Symbols become a shared language between consciousness and deeper layers of the psyche, not imposed, not argued, simply connecting. Each night, when you allow yourself to enter this world of images, you are performing an ancient human act, returning to the way the soul organizes itself before logic emerged. No analysis, no explanation, only presence long enough for images to complete what thought cannot. And from this quiet cooperation, the foundation for deeper movements of the night truly begins to form. Not through effort to change yourself, but by relearning how to listen to the language the psyche has always used. From there, sleep is no longer a break in consciousness, but a natural continuation of inner life. You enter the night with the sense that you have returned to the psyche what belongs to it, and that very act creates a deeper, more peaceful rest without effort. And if this part touched you in a quiet way, not because you learned something new, but because you recognized yourself in it, then I invite you to pause for a moment before leaving. Leave a single word in the comments. No need for long explanations, no need to tell a full story. Just one word that describes the state you are carrying into tonight. Calm, tired, healing, lost, hopeful, or anything that feels true for you at this moment. Sometimes, naming an inner state is already the first step for the psyche to feel seen. And when you write that word, you are not only sharing with others, you are acknowledging to yourself that your inner experience has meaning. I always read those comments, and perhaps from a single small word of yours, someone else may realize they are not alone in this journey of learning to feel themselves again. Number 10. The power of inner acceptance. If during the day humans learn to control in order to survive in the world, then night is the only time when true healing begins as we stop trying to control ourselves. After going through the stages of observing, acknowledging, and listening to inner life, a deeper movement appears before sleep. The ability to accept oneself without the need for immediate correction. This is not giving up, but a very subtle shift in psychological position, from resisting experience to allowing experience to exist. Carl Jung repeatedly emphasized that psychological conflict does not arise from emotions or mistakes themselves, but from the division between what we are and what we believe we must become. During the day, this division is often masked by continuous activity. We fix, adapt, move forward. But when night comes and all roles temporarily quiet down, the distance between these two parts becomes clearer. At this moment, the habitual human reflex is to evaluate oneself. I should have been better, calmer, stronger. What seems harmless actually keeps the psyche in tension because it silently sends the message that a part of oneself is not allowed to exist. Jung expressed this very directly. What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. What is resisted does not disappear, it accumulates energy. When you lie down and continue resisting your fatigue, regret, or limitations, the mind does not truly rest. It is still fighting. Only the battle now happens in silence. Imagine trying to hold a ball underwater. At first it seems easy, but the longer you hold it, the more force you must use. And the moment you release it, the ball bursts upward with the same force you used to push it down. Emotions that are denied in the psyche operate in the same way. Anxiety that is rejected becomes vague tension. Hurt that is not acknowledged turns into overreaction. Fatigue that is not accepted becomes mental exhaustion. Not because humans are weak, but because psychological energy always seeks balance. A woman named Rachel once came to therapy with a persistent sense of failure, even though her external life was completely stable. Every night before sleep, she repeated in her mind a list of things she had not done well enough. Not responding skillfully to her partner, not being patient with her children, not reaching her ideal version of herself. What exhausted her was not the events of the day, but the never-ending inner audit. During the process, she was invited to try a very small change. Before sleep, instead of evaluating the day, simply say one sentence, "Today I lived with the capacity I had." No further analysis, no correction. At first, this made her uncomfortable because it went against her habit of self-improvement. But after a few weeks, Rachel noticed something surprising. Her sleep became deeper, and more importantly, she no longer woke up feeling the need to compensate for the previous day. Her external life did not immediately change, but the way she entered relationships became lighter. Acceptance at night reduced defensiveness during the day. What changed was not her performance in life, but the level of inner conflict. At a deeper level, acceptance before sleep is essentially the act of withdrawing energy from the inner conflict that has been maintained throughout the day. When an experience is no longer evaluated or immediately corrected, the psyche does not need to maintain vigilance to protect the ideal identity you are trying to hold. Consciousness stops acting as controller, and the psychological system begins to return to its natural self-regulating function. In that state, parts that were once opposed no longer compete for recognition, but gradually coexist within a more stable inner structure. According to Jung, acceptance does not mean agreement or surrender. It is the act of bringing an excluded part back into awareness. When you acknowledge your limitations, that today you were tired, reacted imperfectly, did not fully understand everything, the psyche no longer needs to create tension to force your attention. The energy once used to maintain denial begins to be released. This explains why many people feel more peaceful the moment they stop trying to be better before sleep. Acceptance does not reduce growth, it creates the foundation for real growth. Because only when a person stops fighting themselves can energy move toward living rather than defending. Speak to your mind like this before you sleep. Therefore does not mean telling yourself everything is fine, but acknowledging that everything is as it is in your current state. Some days are good enough, some days simply pass, and both deserve to be closed without an inner verdict. Over time, this ritual of acceptance creates a very deep but not immediately visible shift. You begin to react less extremely to others' mistakes. because you no longer need to protect a perfect self-image. Relationships become softer because you do not enter them from a sense of deficiency that needs compensation. Freedom appears not when you become perfect, but when you no longer need to hide imperfection. Night then becomes the place where the psyche restores its wholeness. Not through effort, not through rigid discipline, but through a very human act, allowing yourself to be who you are in a moment when no one is watching. And in that allowance, the mind gradually learns that safety does not come from absolute control, but from the ability to stay with experience without resisting it. When you fall asleep after such acceptance, what happens is not forgetting the old day, but reconciling with it. The psyche no longer needs to carry unfinished parts into tomorrow. And night after night, the reality you experience begins to change in a very quiet way. Less tension, less division, and closer to the feeling of fully living your own life. And from that quiet reconciliation, a new sense of trust gradually forms within you. Not the belief that tomorrow will be perfect, but the assurance that you can meet any experience without turning away from yourself. When the psyche is no longer divided, sleep becomes a natural return, and each morning begins as a gentle continuation rather than a pressured restart. Number 11. Dreams as a guide. So what truly happens when you are deeply asleep and your familiar conscious self temporarily steps off the stage of life? When humans fall asleep, psychological experience does not stop as many assume. On the contrary, according to Carl Jung, this is precisely when a deeper process begins to operate, a process that daytime consciousness rarely has enough space to carry out. Dreams do not appear to entertain or create random stories. They are a continuation of the inner dialogue that was opened before you closed your eyes. If during the day you speak to the mind through thoughts, then at night the psyche responds through images. Jung observed that when the ego rests, the psychological system does not fall into chaos, but shifts into a self-regulating state. Unfinished emotions, conflicts not fully understood, or overly one-sided conscious attitudes begin to be balanced through dreams. He viewed dreams as a natural compensatory mechanism of the psyche, where the unconscious supplements what consciousness has missed during the day. This means dreams not only reflect who you are, but also guide you back toward greater wholeness. A well-known example often mentioned is the experience of Paul McCartney. He once shared that the melody of the song Yesterday came to him fully formed in a dream. Upon waking, he believed he must have heard it somewhere before, because it was too complete to have been created in sleep. But after weeks of asking friends and colleagues, he realized the music truly came from within. What is notable is not just the creativity, but how the psyche continues to process and crystallize experience beyond conscious control. In sleep, when the pressure to create disappears, a deeper structure organizes emotional and memory elements into new forms. Stories like this are not exceptions. Jung observed that many important decisions, personal insights, or creative breakthroughs often appear after sleep, not during intense thinking. This happens because the unconscious is not limited by linear logic. It connects memory, emotion, and symbols into new configurations that daytime consciousness struggles to access. From a modern scientific perspective, this is increasingly understood. During REM sleep, when dreaming is most vivid, the brain shows increased activity in areas related to emotional and memory processing, such as the limbic system, while regions responsible for logic and self-monitoring in the prefrontal cortex decrease activity. This shift allows experiences to be reorganized without being constrained by habitual thinking patterns. The brain is essentially integrating emotional life, connecting fragmented events into broader psychological meaning. What Jung described symbolically is now confirmed biologically. Dreams help the nervous system rebalance and reduce psychological stress. What matters is that the unconscious does not communicate directly. It does not say, "You are anxious because of this," or "You should change that decision." Instead, it presents experience through metaphorical imagery. You may dream of being lost, falling into water, returning to an old house, or meeting someone long forgotten. These images do not need immediate interpretation. Their value lies in the fact that the psyche is continuing to process what the day could not complete. Imagine psychological life as an ecosystem. During the day, you constantly interact, adapt, and respond to the external world. But just as nature needs darkness to restore itself, the psyche needs sleep to re-establish balance. When you sleep, the inner system adjusts subtle imbalances you may not notice, where you tried too hard, where you ignored genuine feelings, where you over-identified with a role. Dreams become that quiet process of adjustment. This explains why the way you enter sleep deeply affects dream quality. Speak to your mind. Like this before you sleep is not about controlling dream content, but about opening a dialogue. When you enter the night with a listening attitude rather than force, the psyche receives the signal that experience can be safely processed. Dreams then become less chaotic and more directional. Many people notice that after deep sleep, problems that once confused them suddenly become clearer without further thinking. This is not magic, but the result of unconscious processing completing its work. Jung emphasized that humans do not heal through willpower alone. Healing occurs when the psyche is allowed to operate its full range of functions, including those beyond consciousness. Over time, when you begin to respect dreams as a form of inner guidance, your relationship with yourself subtly changes. You no longer see sleep as empty space between two working days, but as an active phase of psychological life. Night images become signs that the psyche is trying to maintain balance that consciousness alone cannot sustain. And the deepest truth lies here. The unconscious is not against you. It always moves toward wholeness. Even disturbing or chaotic dreams often appear when the psyche is trying to draw attention to something that needs to be seen. When you learn to enter sleep with trust rather than avoidance, night no longer feels like loss of control, but becomes a space of cooperation between two parts of yourself. Night after night, this process unfolds quietly. No immediate dramatic change, but gradually, daytime reactions become less extreme, intuition clearer, and inner direction more stable. Reality begins to change not because the world is different, but because the psyche has completed its rebalancing work in the dark. And perhaps this is the deepest meaning of speaking to your mind before sleep. You are not only ending a day, but entrusting the deepest part of yourself to continue guiding you when you are no longer trying to control. In the silence of night, that guide is always at work, patient, quiet, and always leading you closer to yourself. And perhaps the most important thing dreams quietly offer is not clear answers, but a subtle sense of direction when you wake, as if something within has been reorganized without conscious effort. Night after night, you begin to realize that transformation does not occur when you try to change your life, but when you allow the psyche to continue guiding you even while you sleep. Number 12. 1 minute of observing the ego. And after dreams have completed their silent work during the night, a very subtle moment begins to appear at the boundary between sleep and waking, where a person can, for the first time, see inner life without being completely carried by it. This is not a special or mystical state, but an almost imperceptible shift. You begin to observe thoughts instead of becoming them. Carl Jung considered this ability an important step in the maturation of consciousness. People often believe they are what they think and feel. When anxiety arises, we say, "I am anxious." When sadness appears, we believe our entire being becomes heavy. But Jung recognized that the psyche contains multiple layers of functioning, and psychological freedom begins when an observing center emerges within. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Becoming oneself, in the Jungian sense, is not strengthening the ego, but realizing that the ego is only a part of a much larger psychological life. The moment before deep sleep or just upon waking is a rare time when this distance naturally appears. Consciousness has not fully returned to roles, memories, and plans of the new day, yet is no longer fully immersed in the unconscious. In that intermediate state, you may notice thoughts passing like clouds across the sky. A thought about yesterday appears and fades. A light emotion arises without explanation. And for the first time, you feel that there is a part of you watching all of this happen. Imagine the mind as a large river. For most of life, people are carried by the current, reacting to every wave and sudden whirlpool. But when observation appears, you are no longer only the flow, you are also standing on the shore. The river continues moving, but you are no longer lost in it. This difference is extremely subtle in experience, yet psychologically profound. Because when you can observe thoughts, they lose the power to define your entire being. I have a friend named James, a photographer who often experienced self-doubt after completing personal projects. Every night before sleep, his mind repeated familiar questions. Am I good enough? Will others judge me? Have I chosen the wrong path? Previously, these thoughts carried tension into the next day. In his inner work, he was guided to spend just 1 minute before sleep, observing any thoughts that appeared without responding. At first, this seemed almost impossible. He was constantly pulled into the content of thought, but gradually he noticed a small shift. Instead of thinking, "I am a failure," he began to see a thought about failure is appearing. That fragile distance significantly reduced the emotional intensity, not because the problem disappeared, but because he was no longer fully identified with it. The following nights became quieter, and more importantly, his decisions the next morning were less driven by defensive reactions. At a deeper level, this moment of observation marks a shift of power within the psyche. Instead of allowing emotions and thoughts to automatically occupy the center, consciousness begins to reposition itself as the space that contains experience. This does not weaken emotion, but changes the relationship with it. When experience is seen rather than identified with, it loses its absolute nature. The psyche no longer needs to react to defend itself. And a new inner stability gradually forms, not based on control, but on the ability to remain present with what is happening. Jung did not see this as merely a psychological skill. For him, the emergence of the observer marks the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming oneself. When you are no longer completely identified with mental content, the psyche becomes more flexible. Strong emotions no longer threaten identity. Negative thoughts no longer immediately dictate action. An inner space opens where choice can arise. Speak to your mind like this. Before you sleep, at this stage, is no longer about saying something specific to yourself. Sometimes, the deepest communication with the mind is silence and observation. You lie down, notice thoughts moving, emotions shifting, and simply acknowledge, this is happening within me. No fixing, no analysis, no turning it into a personal narrative. Over time, that one small minute of observation creates a greater shift than expected. You begin to see that many daytime reactions once believed to be who you are actually habitual patterns. Anger arises and passes. Anxiety appears and dissolves. Joy does the same. And behind it all, there remains a quiet center that does not change, a part of consciousness capable of witnessing without being carried away. This brings a kind of freedom very different from control. You do not need to eliminate negative thoughts to feel stable. You only need not to become them completely. When the distance between observer and mental content is maintained, the psyche no longer needs to react extremely to protect the ego. The energy once used for inner conflict transforms into a more awake presence in life. Night thus becomes a natural training ground for the maturation of consciousness. No complex techniques, no special states required. Just a moment of realizing that thoughts are passing and you are still here, observing. Night after night, this recognition strengthens inner stability, like finding your own axis within the constant movement of the mind. And then, very quietly, the reality you experience begins to change. Not because the external world becomes easier, but because you no longer react to every experience as if it defines you. When you enter sleep with that observing capacity, the psyche is allowed to rest without needing to defend identity. And when you wake, you carry something new yet difficult to name. The feeling that you are no longer completely controlled by what happens within you, but are gradually becoming someone who can live with it in greater clarity and peace. Number 13. Planting intention for the process of individuation, each night as a step of psychological rebirth. When a person has learned to observe inner life without being completely identified with it, a new capacity begins to appear very naturally. Instead of being unconsciously driven by old reactions, one can gently orient the process of becoming oneself. This is no longer the desire for rapid change or self-correction, but conscious participation in the deeper developmental process that Carl Jung called individuation, the process of becoming the person you were formed to become. At this stage, the inner question shifts in a very subtle way. Previously, people often asked, "What do I want to achieve? How do I want to succeed? How do I want to feel better?" But as consciousness matures, the question gradually changes direction. Who am I becoming through the way I live today? This shift may seem small, but it changes your entire relationship with life. Because instead of chasing external outcomes, the psyche begins to organize experience around inner development. Carl Jung once wrote, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. This statement does not suggest that a person creates themselves purely through willpower, but points to something more subtle in Jungian thought. Identity is not fixed by the past or unconscious reactions. Becoming oneself is an ongoing process in which consciousness gradually participates in inner development rather than being entirely led by old patterns. And notably, this process does not primarily occur during the day, but continues quietly at night, when the ego temporarily releases its controlling role. Before sleep, when you place a gentle intention in your mind, not a rigid goal, but a direction of development, the unconscious receives it as a psychological seed. You do not need to repeat positive affirmations or force belief. Just a simple awareness, such as, I want to live more authentically, respond with less fear, become more patient with myself. This intention does not function as a command. It becomes material for the psyche to continue processing in subsequent sleep cycles. Imagine psychological life as a forest growing at night. During the day, you only see the trunks and familiar paths. But when night falls, the root system beneath the ground begins to expand, connect, and reorganize in ways the eye cannot observe. The intention you bring into sleep is like the direction the roots choose to grow. There is no immediate change on the surface, but the living structure is shifting deep below. A practical example can be seen in the early journey of Oprah Winfrey, who often shared that the greatest change in her life did not come from sudden decisions, but from asking herself daily who she was becoming through small choices. In many interviews, she described the habit of spending quiet time before sleep, returning to that inner question rather than evaluating success or failure of the day. Over time, she noticed her responses to pressure, criticism, and disappointment gradually changed without force. What transformed was not the external situation, but the structure of awareness formed through continuous cycles of rest and reflection. From a modern scientific perspective, this has a clear foundation. During sleep, especially in deep and REM stages, the brain reorganizes memory and consolidates neural networks. Experiences with emotional or personal meaning are more likely to be integrated. In other words, what you hold in your mind before sleep influences how the brain organizes lived experience. Jung observed this process through the language of analytical psychology, while modern neuroscience describes it as cognitive restructuring through sleep. Across many nights, old reaction patterns gradually lose their energy, not because you force change, but because the psyche no longer continues to sustain them. Reactions that once felt automatic, defensiveness, anxiety, avoidance, become less necessary. At the same time, new capacities form subtly. A pause before reacting, deeper listening, a sense of stability not dependent on circumstances. Each sleep cycle thus becomes a process of dissolution and restructuring of the ego. A part of yesterday's self quietly closes, making room for a more flexible cognitive structure the next day. This change is rarely noticed immediately. You only realize that things which once triggered strong reactions no longer carry the same weight. New choices appear without the same intense inner struggle. Speak to your mind like this before you sleep. At its deepest stage is no longer a relaxation technique or self-soothing method. It becomes an act of cooperation with the natural developmental process of the psyche. You do not force yourself to become an ideal version, but place into the night a direction and allow the unconscious to continue the work that consciousness alone cannot complete. Over time, you begin to wake up with a feeling that is difficult to describe. The world seems unchanged, yet the way you see it has shifted. Familiar situations no longer trigger old reactions. Relationships become less tense. Decisions emerge more clearly. This is psychological renewal, a rebirth that does not occur in dramatic moments, but through hundreds of small nights you may not even remember. Jung believed that human beings do not transform through willpower alone, but through the long-term cooperation between consciousness and the unconscious. Each time you enter sleep with a sincere intention of who you are becoming, you actively participate in that process. And night after night, the psyche continues to adjust, remove, connect, and restructure inner life toward greater wholeness. At some point, you realize that change is no longer a goal to reach. It has quietly happened. You respond differently, feel differently, live differently, not because you tried to become someone new, but because through countless cycles of sleep and waking, your true self has gradually had enough space to emerge. And from those seemingly ordinary nights, the reality you experience each day is reborn, slowly but sustainably, from the inside out. And perhaps after all, what matters is not how quickly you have changed, but whether you are allowing that process to unfold. Jung believed individuation is not a sudden moment of awakening, but a quiet accumulation across countless nights when you are honest with yourself before sleep. So I want to ask you something very real. Recently, who do you feel you are gradually becoming, and what within you is changing that others may not yet notice? Share your thoughts or story in the comments, because sometimes naming your own transformation is the first step in making it clearer. Number 14. Each night as a step of psychological rebirth. And when a person begins to understand that sleep is not merely biological rest, but a living psychological process, the way we see each night gradually changes. If daytime is where the ego operates to adapt to the world, then night becomes a necessary pause where that structure loosens enough for the psyche to self-regulate. Carl Jung believed psychological life does not develop through sudden leaps, but through repeated cycles of dissolution and reformation. Each time a person falls asleep, part of the daytime ego temporarily loses its rigidity, allowing new arrangements to quietly occur beneath consciousness. We often think we wake up as the same person from the day before, but if observed carefully, this is rarely entirely true. There are mornings when you respond more gently to something that once irritated you. There are thoughts that once obsessed you that suddenly lose their weight without clear reason. Not because you solved the problem through reasoning, but because the psyche continued working while you slept. Psychological rebirth does not happen through conscious decision, but through hundreds of small adjustments that the ego does not immediately recognize. A beautiful image of this process appears in the film Groundhog Day. The character Phil Connors is trapped in the same day, repeating endlessly. At first, he reacts with control, resistance, and despair. But as the loop continues, what changes is not the external situation, but his internal structure. Each new day becomes an opportunity for psychological rebirth. He gradually becomes more patient, kinder, more present, not through a single moment of enlightenment, but through countless cycles of experience, rest, and adjustment. When he finally wakes up in a truly new day, the world has not changed first. He has changed enough to see it differently. From a Jungian perspective, the film clearly reflects a truth. Real transformation happens through quiet, repetitive cycles, just as the psyche restructures itself through each night of sleep. In Zen tradition, there is a similar story. A young monk once asked his teacher, "How long until I reach enlightenment?" The teacher replied, 10 years. The student, worried, said he would double his effort. The teacher smiled and said, "Then 20 years. What confuses the student is what Jung also recognized in psychology. Deep development does not accelerate through forced effort. The more one tries to become a new version of oneself through willpower, the more the ego tightens the old structure. Only when a person allows natural processes, rest, release, rebalancing, to unfold, does change become sustainable. Sleep follows the same logic. When you lie down at night, the daytime ego dissolves like thin ice on a lake as temperature shifts. Fixed beliefs, habitual reactions, and social roles temporarily lose their rigidity. In that state, the psyche has the opportunity to experiment with new structures without threatening your sense of identity. This is why many people wake up with a different perspective on the same problem, even though the night before they felt completely stuck. Imagine a forest after a long winter. For months, the surface appears still, even lifeless. But beneath the cold ground, roots continue to shift, store energy, and prepare for a new cycle. When spring arrives, life seems to emerge suddenly, though it has been prepared for a long time. The human psyche works the same way. The changes you notice during the day are often the result of many nights of reorganization that you are not consciously aware of. What is interesting is that the ego often underestimates the power of this process. We believe we must fix ourselves before sleep, think more positively, resolve problems, or find clear answers. But Jung observed that psychological rebirth happens most effectively when the ego accepts not knowing. When you enter sleep without forcing conclusions, the psyche is allowed to continue its work without interruption. A middle-aged man once described this experience simply. After years of conflict with his father, he tried to resolve everything through argument and reasoning, but failed. One night, exhausted, he simply accepted that he did not yet understand the relationship. No decision was made, but a few weeks later he noticed his reactions in conversations became softer. Not because he consciously changed his views, but because something within had been reorganized through time and repeated cycles of rest and sleep. This is what Jung referred to as psychological renewal. The ego is not destroyed, but gradually refreshed. Old patterns do not disappear immediately. They simply lose energy when no longer reinforced daily. At the same time, new ways of responding form almost invisibly, like muscles developing through repeated rest between training sessions, rather than during exertion itself. Speak to your mind. Like this before you sleep, at this stage, is no longer about directing the mind to change, but about allowing the process of rebirth to occur. When you enter sleep with trust that the psyche knows how to balance itself, you stop interfering with the process that has existed for millions of years in human structure. And that trust creates a profound shift. You no longer see tomorrow as a continuation of today's exhaustion, but as a new possibility being prepared in silence. Each morning thus becomes a subtle return. You carry the memory of the old day, but are no longer completely bound by old reactions. A part of you has been renewed, even if you cannot identify exactly when it happened. And through hundreds of such cycles, the reality you experience gradually changes, not because the world becomes different, but because the person perceiving it has been reborn many times in the quiet darkness of each night. Perhaps the deepest insight Jung pointed to is this: human beings do not transform in dramatic moments, but in cycles so ordinary that we rarely notice them. Each night you sleep does not just end a day, it closes a temporary version of yourself. And when you wake, however subtly, a slightly different person has already begun continuing the journey of life. Number 15. Bringing the night state into daytime reality. And if the entire nighttime process truly has meaning, then its clearest sign does not lie in dreams or the feeling of sleep, but in how you begin a new day without even realizing you have changed. Inner transformation does not seek grand evidence. It reveals itself through very small choices, so ordinary they are easy to overlook. Jung always emphasized that the psyche is not separate from real life. What happens in the unconscious at night will find its way into daytime behavior, because human psychology is a continuous system with no true boundary between sleep and waking. Morning thus becomes the most honest mirror of the silent work done during the night. There are days when you wake feeling lighter without knowing why. A problem that once caused tension no longer feels urgent. A conversation that once triggered defensiveness is now met with calmness. No conscious decision has been made, yet the way you are present in the world has shifted. Jung saw this as a sign that the psyche is moving toward deeper balance, where reactions are no longer fully governed by old patterns. Imagine inner life as adjusting the rudder of a large ship in the ocean. When you change direction by only a few degrees, the difference is almost unnoticeable at first. The ship still moves across the same water, under the same sky. But after many hours or days, it arrives at an entirely different shore. What happens before sleep, how you speak to your mind, how you close the day, how you allow the psyche to restructure, is like those small adjustments of the rudder. Daytime is simply where the results gradually appear. A very practical example can be seen in Adam, a person working in a high-pressure environment, often feeling the need to respond immediately to every demand. Previously, each morning began with unconscious tension, checking the phone immediately upon waking, preparing mentally for conflict, and entering the day in a defensive state. After practicing closing the day with observation and acceptance before sleep, he noticed a small but clear shift. One morning, when receiving a familiar work message, he did not react immediately. Not through forced restraint, but simply because there was no longer an inner pressure. He responded a few minutes later with greater clarity, and the interaction became much lighter. No new communication technique had been learned, only the inner structure had shifted enough to produce a different response. This is how reality transforms in the Jungian sense. The external world rarely changes quickly, but your experience of it changes when the inner psychological center shifts. When the psyche is less divided, you see more possibilities in the same situation. When inner conflict decreases, relationships naturally become less tense. What is often called luck is sometimes simply the result of no longer reacting from old fear. At a deeper level, This shift also affects how psychological time is experienced. When the inner world is no longer pulled backward by undigested residues of the recent past, consciousness becomes more fully present in the current moment. You no longer live simultaneously in multiple versions of yourself: the one who failed yesterday, the one who must improve tomorrow, but begin to act from a unified present state. This unity reduces the subtle sense of urgency that exhausts people without them knowing why. When the psyche no longer has to divide energy to maintain inner conflict, attention deepens, and even small choices carry a completely different quality. What matters is that these changes often appear at a micro level. You choose to rest instead of pushing yourself. You listen longer before responding. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself in every situation. These small choices accumulate over time and gradually reshape the direction of life. Jung called this the manifestation of individuation in daily life, when inner development is no longer confined to thought or therapy, but becomes the way you live each day. There is an interesting paradox here. The more a person tries to directly change reality, the more stuck they feel. But when they change their relationship with the mind before sleep, reality begins to shift without force. This is like changing the source of light in a room. The objects remain in the same place, but how they are seen becomes completely different. Night is where that light is adjusted. Over time, you begin to realize that your morning state is no longer random. It reflects the level of harmony or conflict carried over from the night before. Nights closed with acceptance and observation often lead to mornings that begin with natural stability. Conversely, when you carry self-judgment into sleep, the psyche continues operating in tension, and that appears immediately upon waking. Speak to your mind like this. Before you sleep, therefore, is not just a nighttime ritual, but a preparation for tomorrow's reality. Every word you speak to your mind before sleep becomes the ground from which morning awareness grows. You do not need to force yourself to become a new person. You only need to allow the old structure to be adjusted through many cycles of night. Gradually, the change becomes clearer. Things that once triggered strong reactions no longer control you. You make decisions from awareness rather than reflex. The world still contains pressure, uncertainty, and challenge, but the inner experience becomes wider. You no longer feel you are fighting life, but moving with it. And perhaps this is the deepest meaning of bringing the night state into the day. Healing does not end when you wake up. It continues in every choice, every conversation, every moment you respond instead of react. Over time, these small changes accumulate into a new reality, not because you control the world better, but because you are living from a psychological structure that has become more unified with yourself. Looking back at the entire journey we have just gone through, one thing becomes clear. The transformation of reality does not begin with grand decisions during the day, but with how you end a day in silence. Reality rarely changes because you try to control life better. It changes when your relationship with your own mind shifts. And the moment before sleep is where that change quietly begins. When you learn to observe instead of judge, accept instead of resist, release the persona, listen to the body, meet the shadow, and close the day without self-condemnation, you are not only sleeping deeper, you are allowing the psyche to complete work that consciousness cannot do alone. Each night, small conflicts are reconciled, old patterns lose energy, and a more unified inner structure begins to form. You do not wake as a completely new person, but subtly, you are no longer the person of yesterday. Carl Jung believed that human beings do not change through forced will, but through long-term cooperation between consciousness and the unconscious. When you speak to your mind before sleep with respect and honesty, you are planting a direction into the night. And while you rest, the psyche continues to organize, adjust, and guide you closer to your own wholeness. Transformation is therefore not loud or dramatic, but sustainable, because it unfolds from the inside out. If this journey has touched you, share it with someone who needs a gentler way to change their life. And if you want to continue exploring the psychological depth of Carl Jung, subscribe to the channel to accompany the next videos. Because sometimes, what shapes tomorrow is not what you do while awake, but how you whisper to yourself just before closing your eyes. And within that whisper, a new reality begins to form.